The sentence that ended 5 years of waiting sounded almost casual. You will be there tomorrow, Hannah. You always are. Alpha King James Walker thought he was stating a fact. 7 dinners later, the chair at his right would still be empty. That night, he said the words while fastening the silver clasp of his formal coat. Hannah Miller stood beside the dining table in his private rooms, staring at 2 untouched plates and a small honey cake the kitchen had prepared 5 years earlier, in a chapel hidden beneath the West Tower. He had called her his mate and promised that secrecy would last only until his father's final succession disputes were settled. Since then, there had always been one more reason to wait. A border vote. A harvest crisis. His coronation. A rebellion in the Eastern Hills. Then negotiations with West Ridge. Tonight was the 5th anniversary of the private bond no one in the kingdom was allowed to call official. James had promised dinner at 8, but a council request arrived before then. He returned only long enough to change coats and tell her the visiting delegation had added a late working reception in the council salon. Daniel can move our dinner, he said. I need you downstairs to host until I arrive. Hannah looked at him. You want me to host another royal table as what? James paused. As you always do. That was not my question. He exhaled, already tired. Hannah, not tonight. That is what you said last year. This is a treaty week. Last year was a succession week. And the year before that, my mother was ill. I remember. Her calm made him impatient because anger would have been easier to answer. What do you want me to do? Walk away from the council because we planned dinner. I want you to stop acting as if the only choices are abandoning the kingdom or abandoning me. James ran a hand through his dark hair. No one is abandoning you. Hannah glanced at the untouched cake. You keep saying that because I keep being here when you come back. He softened then, but not enough. He crossed the room, touched her shoulder, and said the words that finally made the whole pattern visible. You will be there tomorrow. You always are. Hannah looked at his hand until he removed it. Go to your council. James hesitated, then kissed her forehead and left. Hannah did not go downstairs. For the first time in 5 years, a royal reception began without her. Daniel Foster, the senior steward, sent a footman to ask whether she was ill. Hannah answered that she was not. She ate 1 spoonful of the honey cake alone, packed a small suitcase, and slept in the guest cottage near the South Gardens. The next evening, James entered the state dining hall expecting to find Hannah in her usual chair at his right. Her place was set exactly as always. Blue napkin, silver cup, the tiny sprig of rosemary Daniel placed there because Hannah disliked heavy flowers near food. But the chair was empty. James glanced toward the doors. Where is Miss Miller? He asked. Daniel's face remained professional. She has taken the evening for herself, Your Majesty. James frowned. Did she say when she was coming? No. The visiting diplomat, Sophia Grant, sat 3 seats away and watched the exchange without comment. James told himself Hannah needed one night to be angry. He conducted dinner, discussed timber routes, approved a border inspection schedule, and looked toward the empty chair more often than he meant to. When the final guest left, he found a folded note beneath the rosemary sprig. Hannah's handwriting was neat. I will not be at dinner tomorrow either. Please stop setting a place for me as if my presence is guaranteed. James read it twice. Then he looked at Daniel. She is upset. Daniel's expression did not change. Yes, Your Majesty. James folded the note. She will come back. The steward lowered his eyes. Perhaps. James almost corrected him. Instead, he stared at the chair and heard his own voice from the night before. You always are. For the first time, the words sounded less like confidence and more like a warning he had failed to understand. On the second night, James ordered Hannah's place set again. He told himself it was courtesy, not expectation. Daniel said nothing while the servants placed the blue napkin and silver cup beside the king. At 7, the guests entered. At 7:15, the chair remained empty. By 7:30, James had stopped pretending he was not watching the door. He finished the meal early and went directly to Hannah's rooms in the royal wing. The door was unlocked. Her dresses were gone. So were the books that had occupied the shelf beside his, the small painted box where she kept letters from her sister, and the wool shawl she left over the back of his reading chair every winter. James walked through the rooms twice, as if her things might reappear if he entered from a different angle. On the desk lay 3 folders labeled for the household office. Hannah had transferred every active duty to other staff. Seating plans, guest preferences, charity petitions. correspondence from widows of fallen guards. Problems James had never noticed because Hannah had handled them before they reached him. A fourth folder contained a formal leave request, signed that morning. 30 days away from all royal household duties. James carried it downstairs. Who approved this? He asked Daniel. I did, Your Majesty. Household leave does not require the king's signature. She did not speak to me. Daniel met his eyes. She has spoken to you many times. James disliked the answer because he could not call it disrespectful without proving the point. Where is she staying? The South Cottage. Alone. Her choice. James walked there without a guard. Hannah opened the door after his second knock. She wore a simple cream sweater and a dark skirt, clothes he associated with quiet mornings rather than palace dinners. Behind her, a kettle hissed over the fire. You moved out. For now? You filed leave. Yes. Without telling me. Hannah's eyebrows lifted. I left the paperwork in my rooms. That is not what I mean. I know. James stepped closer, but stayed outside. Is this because of one dinner? Hannah looked at him for so long that the question embarrassed him before she answered. No. Then tell me what it is about. 5 years. He went still. Hannah, 5 years of being introduced as your archivist, your hostess, your advisor, sometimes your companion, depending on who was asking. 5 years of doing everything a Luna does except being allowed to know whether I will ever be one. I told you I will formalize the bond. When? James opened his mouth. She waited. The silence answered for him. That is what I mean, she said. There is always a better time coming. The treaty is almost finished. Then it will be the spring council. Then the northern elections. Then something else. You know what my position requires. I do. I have organized half of what your position requires. Her voice did not rise. I am not asking you to stop being king. I am asking why being king has always meant I must become easier to postpone. James felt anger rise and recognized, with unusual clarity, that it was fear wearing armor. So what now? You live in a cottage until I prove something. Hannah shook her head. You are still making this about what you need to do to get me back into the palace. Because I want you back. You want the life that worked for you. That silenced him. She stepped inside and picked up a document from the table. I have resigned as royal hostess. James stared at the paper. You cannot just resign from a role that is part of our life. It was never an official role. That is why I can. He had no answer. Hannah placed the document in his hand. I am keeping my archive position for now. I will work from the public records office. I will not host dinners, receive visiting Lunas, manage your private correspondence, or sit beside you because everyone assumes I belong there. James looked toward the palace lights beyond the garden. For how long? I do not know. Will you be at dinner tomorrow? Her expression softened with something almost like sadness. No. The third night had not even begun, and James already knew the chair would be empty. By the third night, the empty chair had become visible to everyone. James considered having it removed before the West Ridge delegation arrived, but the thought felt too much like pretending Hannah had never sat there. So the chair remained, neatly set and untouched. Sophia Grant entered the dining hall with the rest of the diplomats and paused when she saw it. Still absent, she asked quietly. James gave her a look. This is not a diplomatic matter. Everything at a royal table becomes a diplomatic matter. She took her own seat 3 places down. Halfway through dinner, West Ridge's elder envoy, Charles Mercer, asked the question James had been avoiding. Is Miss Miller unwell? No. Then should we be concerned about a change in the royal household? James set down his glass. No. Mercer nodded, but his gaze moved to the empty chair. Forgive me. We have always understood Miss Miller to function as your Luna in all but title. The room went silent. James felt the old instinct to control language. Hannah has served the crown in several capacities. Sophia's mouth tightened. Mercer continued carefully. Our previous visits were coordinated by her. She negotiated the relief fund after the flood, received our Luna when she was ill, and mediated the dispute over Eastern grazing rights. We assumed the formal title was delayed for ceremonial reasons. James looked around the table and realized everyone was waiting for him to explain a private compromise he had never expected strangers to examine. The timing has been complicated. Sophia leaned back. For 5 years. James turned toward her. You are a guest. I am also the person your council keeps suggesting might be useful as a future match. Several heads lowered. Sophia continued before James could stop her. I would prefer that rumor die before it becomes policy. I am not interested in occupying another woman's life because the king found her patience convenient. The words hit harder because they came from someone with nothing to gain by saying them. James dismissed the subject and finished dinner, but the conversation followed him into the corridor. Daniel was waiting with the nightly household reports. How many of these did Hannah usually review? James asked. Daniel glanced down. Most. Before I saw them. Yes. And the charity petitions. She sorted them. Visiting households. She handled them. Why did no one tell me? Daniel's face showed the first crack in his professional calm. We thought you knew. James went to the public records office the next morning. Hannah was at a long table with 3 clerks, reviewing old land claims. She did not stop working when he entered. Can we talk? After I finish this page. James waited. It took 4 minutes. He noticed the clerks trying very hard not to look at him. When Hannah finally closed the ledger, she led him to a side room. Sophia embarrassed you, she said. Sophia told the truth. Hannah blinked, surprised. James continued. I did not understand how much of the household you were carrying. That is not the apology you think it is. I am not trying to make it one. Good. She folded her arms. If you did not know, it means you were comfortable benefiting from work you never bothered to see. He nodded slowly. Yes. Hannah's expression changed. She had expected defense. I want a list of every unofficial duty you were doing, James said. Why? So I can assign them properly. To make my absence easier. To stop expecting one person to do unpaid work because she loves me. The answer surprised both of them. Hannah looked away first. Daniel has most of the records. James moved toward the door. Will you come to dinner tonight? No. He almost asked why, then stopped. All right. Before leaving the records office, he sent Daniel a message. Do not set Hannah's place tonight. Leave the chair. It was the first time James changed the table before the table forced him to notice she was gone. The 4th night was the first time James did not pretend Hannah might arrive. He told Daniel to leave the chair, but remove the place setting. The distinction felt strange. An empty chair could be absence. A prepared plate was expectation. James was beginning to understand how much of his life had been built on the second. After dinner, he rode to the South Cottage again. Hannah opened the door and sighed. You know the palace has messengers. I did not come to summon you. That is progress. She led him inside. James noticed there were no royal objects in the cottage. No crest. No formal gifts. Even the silver hairpin he had given her during his coronation was missing. Where's the pin? He asked before he could stop himself. Hannah gave him a tired look. Really? Sorry. He sat across from her at the small kitchen table. I asked Daniel for the list. And it is 27 pages. That sounds like Daniel. I signed orders today making 6 of those duties formal staff positions. Hannah stared at him. Good. James waited for more and realized he had come hoping she would reward him for fixing a problem that should never have existed. He rubbed his hands together. I keep doing that. Doing what? Turning every decent action into evidence for my case. Hannah studied him. You always liked winning. I am beginning to dislike what I thought winning meant. Outside, rain tapped the windows. James looked at the kettle, the plain curtains, the stack of public archive files beside Hannah's chair. When did you start thinking about leaving the royal wing? Last winter. The answer hurt more than he expected. That long. You canceled our bond announcement 3 days before the ceremony. My mother had pneumonia. I know. Then you know why. James, this is exactly the problem. Every reason was real. Hannah's voice remained steady. That is why I stayed. I could always explain you to myself. She opened a drawer and took out a small notebook. After the canceled ceremony, I started writing down the promises instead of the reasons. She slid it across the table. James opened the first page. Spring Council, announce after vote. Postponed. Summer Treaty, register after signing. Postponed. Harvest Festival, public seating as Luna. Postponed. Winter Ceremony. Cancelled. The entries continued for pages. Some were large promises. Others were small. Dinner at 8. Returned at 11. Weekend at the lake. Cancelled. Meet Hannah's sister. Rescheduled twice. James closed the notebook. Why did you never show me this? Because I thought keeping score was petty. It is not petty. I know that now. He looked at her. You waited anyway. Yes. Why? Hannah's eyes filled, but her voice did not break. Because every time you came back, you were sorry. And every time you were sorry, I thought the next promise would be the one you kept. James stared at the table. I love you. I know. That sounds like it does not matter. It matters. It just does not solve this. He nodded. What would? Hannah leaned back. Consistency. Not a grand gesture. Not a crown. Not a public speech because I am angry. I need to know whether your word means the same thing when no one is watching. James looked at the notebook again. How do I prove that? You do not prove it tonight. Of course. A sad smile touched her mouth. That is also the problem. You want a deadline. He almost smiled back. I am a king. We like schedules. Then schedule yourself some patience. James stood to leave. At the door, he said, there is a founders' dinner in 3 nights. The council will expect you. The council can expect whatever it wants. I know. He paused. I am not asking you to come. Hannah looked at him carefully. Thank you. James rode back to the palace knowing the next dinner would begin without her again. For the first time, he understood that the chair was not the problem. The problem was the man who had believed it would always be filled. On the 5th morning, James canceled nothing. That alone felt unnatural. His schedule included a council session at 9, military reports at 11, lunch with West Ridge at 1, and a ceremonial inspection at 4. At 6, Daniel reminded him that the state dinner began at 7. James looked at the page and saw what he had missed for years. There was no space left for anything unexpected, which meant Hannah had always been the thing moved when the unexpected arrived. How often did I change plans with her? James asked. Daniel did not pretend not to understand. Frequently. More than with counsel. Far more. Why? Because the council would object. James leaned back. And Hannah would not. Usually she said she understood. James closed the schedule. That is worse. He spent the afternoon reviewing the notebook Hannah had shown him, not because she had given it to him, but because he had copied the dates before leaving. He matched them against palace records. The pattern was undeniable. When the crown had demanded flexibility, he had always taken it from the person least likely to punish him. At dinner that evening, Robert Hale, an elder councilman, pointed toward Hannah's empty chair. This cannot continue through Founders' Night. People are talking. Let them. Hale frowned. The absence makes the household look unstable. Say she is ill until Founders' Night is over. James set down his fork. Months earlier, he might have accepted the suggestion because it sounded harmless and protected appearances. No, he said. Her presence made this household look stable because she was doing work this council never formally recognized. Miss Miller has resigned as royal hostess and taken leave from all unofficial household duties. She is not ill. She is not being punished. She chose to step away. Hale looked uneasy. And when will she return? James heard the question the way Hannah must have heard it for years. When will she return? When will she resume? When will she make everyone comfortable again? I do not know, he said. That is her decision. Sophia Grant watched him with a more thoughtful expression than before. Later, she found him outside the dining hall. That was almost responsible. James gave her a dry look. Your praise overwhelms me. Do not get used to it. She glanced toward the empty chair through the open doors. Are you leaving that there for her? I do not know. Then decide why it is there. James looked at her. Sophia continued. If it is a reminder to you, fine. If it is a message to Hannah that her place is waiting and she should hurry back, then you are still assigning her a role without asking. After the guests left, James returned to his study instead of sending Hannah an explanation. He drafted orders dividing her former duties among paid staff and wrote a separate instruction requiring her name to be restored to the flood relief records, treaty files, and household reports that had used her work without credit. He left both documents and signed on his desk for the morning, because changing the system mattered more than making sure Hannah heard about it first. Near midnight, Daniel brought him a sealed note from the South Cottage. Hannah had heard what James said at dinner. Her handwriting was steady. Thank you for telling the truth without turning me into a tragedy. Please do not turn the empty chair into a permanent promise that I am coming back. I do not know yet. James read the final line 3 times. I do not know yet. Not yes. Not no. For once, he understood that uncertainty was not a delay he was entitled to manage. It was Hannah's answer, and his job was to live honestly inside it. The court's patience ended on the 6th day. By breakfast, 3 elders had requested a private audience. By noon, James's mother had crossed the palace from her apartments and entered his study without knocking. Margaret Walker had been Luna for 27 years before James's father died. She had raised him to believe duty came before comfort, and she had always liked Hannah. That made her criticism worse. Founders Night is tomorrow, Margaret said. Every pack in the region will be represented. Hannah cannot leave that chair empty again. James kept signing the document in front of him. She can. James. She resigned. She is your Omega. That does not make her royal property. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Do not twist my words. Then what are you asking me to do? Bring her home. James set down the pen. How? Margaret opened her mouth and stopped. The old answer would have been obvious. The Alpha King could order a member of his household to attend a state event. James watched his mother realize that saying it aloud would expose the problem. She sat down. When your father became Alpha, there were years I waited for him too. Did you want to? One had very little to do with it. That is not the defense you think it is. Margaret looked toward the window. No, perhaps it is not. Her voice softened. We were taught patience was part of being Luna, and I turned Hannah's patience into part of being loved. Margaret did not argue. After she left, James signed the orders he had drafted the night before and added 2 documents of his own. The first confirmed Hannah's resignation from every unofficial household role and reassigned those duties to paid staff. The second granted her independent use of the South Cottage for as long as she wanted, with no condition tied to palace service or their relationship. He also signed a public service record restoring Hannah's name to 5 years of work, from flood relief to diplomatic hosting. He sent everything through Henry Morris, the public records clerk, not through a royal messenger. There was no personal note attached. Hannah received them that afternoon. She read the first document standing at her desk, the second beside the cottage window, and the third twice. Her name appeared on work she had once watched disappear beneath James's seal. She sat down. Slowly, Daniel visited an hour later carrying a box of personal items from her old rooms. The king asked me to make sure these reached you before Founders Night. Did he ask whether I was coming? No. Hannah looked at him. Not once. Daniel smiled faintly. He looked as though the question was physically painful to swallow, but no. Hannah laughed despite herself. She opened the box and found her books, the painted letters box from her sister, and the wool shawl that had spent 3 winters over James's reading chair. Nothing had been arranged as a message. They were simply hers, returned because they belonged to her. That evening, the 6th state dinner began. James entered on time. Hannah's chair remained beside him, empty and unset. Robert Hale made one comment about appearances. James ignored it. Sophia asked about road tariffs. Margaret discussed winter stores. The meal continued. Halfway through, James realized something unexpected. He was not watching the doors. He still missed Hannah. The absence still hurt, but he was no longer treating each minute as evidence that she might give in. After dinner, he wrote one sentence in his private journal. She is not late. She is choosing not to be here. The difference should have been obvious years ago. He closed the book and went to bed. At the South Cottage, Hannah folded the wool shawl over the back of her own chair. Tomorrow would be the 7th night. She had no intention of attending the founders' dinner. But for the first time since leaving the royal wing, she found herself wondering what James would do when everyone expected him to force the story back into its old shape. Founders' night arrived. By sunset, the palace courtyard was lined with carriages, banners, and guards in formal black. The dining hall had been expanded for 120 guests. Hannah spent the afternoon at the public records office, determined not to measure the hours. At 6:30, she returned to the South Cottage and changed into a simple gray dress. She was not going to dinner. She told herself that twice. At 7, bells rang from the palace tower. Inside the dining hall, James stood to welcome the visiting packs. The chair beside James was still there because the founders' table had been built and measured weeks earlier, but nothing marked it as Hannah's place. For the 7th night, it stood empty. There was no place setting before it. No rosemary. No folded napkin. Just a chair no one had the right to fill for her. Elder Hale approached James before the first course. Your Majesty, there is still time to send someone. James looked at him. For what? To bring Miss Miller. No. This is Founders' Night. I am aware. Hale lowered his voice. People will interpret her absence as a rejection of the crown. James glanced around the hall. Then they can learn the crown survives being rejected. Sophia nearly smiled into her wine. The dinner continued. James gave his speech, announced the completed West Ridge Agreement, and publicly thanked the household staff by name, including Hannah for the prior years of diplomatic coordination. He did not call her Luna. He did not call her his mate. He did not say he hoped she would return. He simply credited the work she had done. At 9:30, the final toast ended. James remained beside the table after the guests began leaving. Daniel approached. "The chair?" he asked. James looked at it for a long moment. Hannah's note had asked him not to preserve the empty seat as a promise. He finally understood. "Remove the place tomorrow," he said. "The chair too?" James swallowed. "Yes." Daniel nodded. "Where should it go?" "Storage. And if Miss Miller returns?" James looked toward the open doors. "Then we ask where she wants to sit." At that exact moment, Hannah was crossing the rear corridor of the palace. She had come only to collect the final signed service record Henry told her was ready. She had chosen the quiet archive entrance because the formal guests would be leaving through the front. Near the dining hall, she heard Daniel's voice. She stopped before the doorway, hidden by the stone arch. "And if Miss Miller returns?" Then James answered. "Then we ask where she wants to sit." Hannah closed her eyes. It was such a small sentence. No declaration. No apology. No demand. Yet it reached the place in her that 5 years of promises had failed to reach because it contained something those promises rarely had. Choice. She waited until James left before entering the empty hall. Daniel was removing candles from the tables. He saw her and said nothing. Hannah walked to the chair beside James's. For 7 nights it had been empty. She touched the carved back. "He is removing it. Tomorrow morning." "Good." Daniel looked at her carefully. "Are you?" "Am I what?" "Coming back." Hannah smiled faintly. "You sound like the council." "Occupational hazard." She looked toward James's chair. "I do not know." Daniel nodded. "That seems to be an acceptable answer now." Hannah collected her service record from the archive and left through the front doors rather than the side corridor. The next morning, James entered the dining hall and saw the space beside his chair completely empty. No place setting. No reserved seat. Nothing waiting for Hannah. He felt the loss more sharply than he had all week. Then Daniel handed him a note. Hannah had written only one line. "If you still want dinner with me, ask me somewhere neither of us has an assigned seat." James read Hannah's note at least 10 times before he allowed himself to smile. Then he did something the old version of himself would not have done. He checked his calendar before answering. Wednesday was impossible. Thursday had a military review that might run late. Friday was clear after 6. He wrote back, "Friday at 7, at Miller's Cafe in the South Village. I will be there at 6:50. If that does not work for you, choose another time." Hannah laughed when she read it because Miller's Cafe had no connection to her family despite the name, and because James had included the exact arrival time like a man submitting evidence. She accepted. On Friday, James reached the cafe at 6:43. Hannah arrived at 6:58 and found the Alpha King sitting at a corner table in a plain dark coat. "You are early," she said. I panicked. About dinner. About being late. She sat across from him. There was no royal chair. No blue napkin. No steward deciding where she belonged. They ordered stew and bread. For the first 20 minutes, neither mentioned the palace. James asked about her archive work. Hannah asked about West Ridge. He told her Sophia had threatened to charge consulting fees every time the council tried to use her as a marriage rumor. Hannah laughed so hard she nearly spilled her water. When the plates were cleared, James became serious. "I want to ask you something, and I am trying very hard not to make it sound like a proposal. That is an alarming introduction. Would you let me court you again?" Hannah looked at him. "From the beginning. From wherever you think the beginning should be. And what happens to my archive position?" "Nothing. The South Cottage. Yours as long as you want it. If I never become Luna." His face tightened, but he answered, "Then you never become Luna. If I decide I cannot trust you enough to continue, then I will hate it, but I will respect it." Hannah looked down at her hands. "I do not want gifts." "Good. I am terrible at them. No public speeches about us." "Agreed. 1 dinner a week." "Agreed. And if you say 7, you arrive by 7. James nodded solemnly. "I have learned that particular lesson." Hannah studied him for another moment. "All right. 1 dinner." James exhaled. "That is technically the dinner we are currently having. Do not get clever." "Sorry." She smiled. Over the next 2 months, 1 dinner became a pattern. James did not perform perfection. Once, a council emergency threatened to make him late. He sent Hannah a message at 5, explained the problem, and asked whether she preferred 8 or another night. She chose another night. He arrived on time. Another week, Hannah canceled because her sister visited. James did not sulk. He did not send flowers to make himself visible. He simply wrote, "Enjoy your evening." The simplicity of it began rebuilding something larger than romance. Meanwhile, the palace household changed. Duties were formally assigned. Staff were paid for work Hannah had once absorbed. Daniel claimed the palace ran worse for 2 weeks and better after that. In early spring, the council created a new position to oversee public welfare records and household petitions, independent of the Luna's office. James offered Hannah the job through the council secretary, with a salary and authority approved before her name was attached. Hannah accepted after negotiating 2 changes. She would report to the full council, not directly to James, and she could keep her office outside the royal wing. He agreed. On her first day in the new position, Hannah entered the dining hall to review accessibility changes for visiting elders. The space beside James's chair was still open. No one had replaced her chair. James came in carrying budget papers and stopped when he saw her looking at the empty space. Daniel says we need a smaller table for working dinners. Daniel is usually right. He enjoys hearing that. Hannah turned to James. Are you going to put the chair back? He shook his head. Not unless someone asks for one. She nodded. That evening, during their weekly dinner at the cafe, James reached across the table and stopped before touching her hand. May I? Hannah looked at his fingers, then at his face. Yes. He took her hand. It was the first time in months she had allowed the gesture, and James did not tighten his grip as if afraid she would disappear. He simply held on while she chose to stay. By midsummer, Hannah no longer counted how many dinners James kept. That was how she knew the pattern had changed. Consistency had stopped feeling remarkable. It had become ordinary. James still had emergencies. Hannah still had work that mattered outside the palace. Sometimes they went 3 days without seeing each other. The difference was that neither person treated the other's time as automatically available. On the anniversary of the West Ridge Treaty, the palace hosted its largest state dinner since Founders' Night. Hannah attended in her official role as Director of Public Welfare Records. She wore a deep blue dress because she liked it, not because royal tradition required it. When she entered the dining hall, she stopped. The tables had been rearranged. James's chair remained at the center, but there was no chair beside him marked for Hannah. No blue napkin. No rosemary. No silent assumption. Daniel approached with a seating chart. Ms. Miller, we have 3 open places. One with the council delegation, one near the archives committee, and one beside His Majesty. Hannah looked at him. You are making me choose. The king insisted. Across the room, James was greeting visitors. He glanced toward her, but did not signal, did not point, did not ask. Hannah studied the 3 options. 5 years earlier, she would have considered the seat beside him proof that she mattered. 7 empty nights had taught her something different. A chair could be an honor, a burden, a habit, or a claim. Its meaning depended on whether the person sitting there had chosen it. Beside James, she said. Daniel smiled. Very good. A servant placed a chair at the king's right only then. James watched without moving. When Hannah crossed the room and sat down, he leaned toward her. Are you sure? You asked where I wanted to sit. I did. This is where I want to sit tonight. James smiled. Tonight is enough. During dinner, no one asked when their bond would be formalized. Margaret caught Hannah's eye once from across the table and gave a small, knowing smile. Months earlier, she had apologized for helping teach James that an Omega's patience was part of her duty. Hannah had accepted the apology and left the lesson where it belonged, in the past. Later, when the hall had emptied, James and Hannah remained at the long table. The chair she had chosen sat beside his. I have a question, James said. That sounds dangerous. Not the Luna question. Then proceed. He looked unusually nervous. Do you want our private bond registered publicly? Hannah was quiet. Why now? Because I want it recognized, but I do not want recognition to become another promise I schedule for you. And if I say not yet, then not yet. She looked at the empty tables, remembering the 7 nights when absence had spoken more clearly than every conversation before them. I want it registered, she said. James did not move. Are you sure? Hannah smiled. You really like that question now. I am making up for lost time. Yes, I am sure. But I am keeping my office. Obviously. And the council does not get to call me Luna in every document just because we register the bond. Agreed. And if you ever say, you will be there tomorrow. You always are. I reserve the right to throw bread at you. James laughed. That seems fair. He held out his hand, but did not take hers. Hannah looked at it, then placed her hand in his. The next morning, The bond was registered in the public archive under both their names. No coronation followed. No grand ceremony was needed. The record did not restore the old life. It recognized the new one. Hannah had once left the chair beside James empty because he believed she would always wait. Now that chair meant something only because she was free to leave it empty again. She stayed because she chose to.